Hello, my name is Daniel Stillwell. Welcome. This is an interview with Dr. Wendel and Dr. John Miller. We're going to be talking about one of the articles that they have recently written that's been published in the International Journal for Systemic Therapy. Thank you both for joining us today. John is in Shanghai and Wendel is in Louisiana. And so we've got a full global spectrum today. I'd like to start off with a first question that I try to ask everybody, which is, what kind of mental health practitioner do you identify as, and what does that look like in your context? And Wendel, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Daniel. I am a psychiatric social worker. My first graduate degree is as a master's in social work, and I have a PhD in family therapy as well. But I'm still a social worker and clinically oriented, trained, and so I guess my identity is as a social worker principally, and then as a systemically oriented marriage and family therapist is my second, I guess, orientation.
Do you have a
John?
practice still?
Oh yes, it's very small. Thank God I don't have to make a living by seeing clients. That's hard. That's very time consuming. In some senses, at least, it seems easier. Although I must say, I love working with people. And so I also continue to supervise. We have one-way mirrors and do live supervision, group supervisions at the university where I teach. And so I'm still involved in that way as well. And I hope I never stop doing that. Let me say, John, as we were waiting for you to come on, Daniel and I got talking about, and this just came to my mind. I think that Paul Watzlawick, certainly John Weakland, Dick Fish, had practices almost to the time that they passed away. Wow. I mean, one of the advantages of our discipline is you can retire if you feel like it, or you can just cut back if you feel like it, right?
Wonderful. John, what about you? What do you identify as, and what does it look like where you are?
Well, honestly, it's no surprise that I'm on this interview with Dr. Ray, because I was trained by him actually in the same tradition he speaks of.
Wow.
It was largely the Mental Research Institute ideas, and which he transmitted to me, and eventually he brought me on at the MRI as a research assistant associate, and that's how we got to know Paul. And Wendel and I always saw eye to eye clinically, so I'd probably answer the same he would. Although I guess the other piece is that I have taken my work international, specifically to Asia, all around Asia. About 16 years ago, they opened up to mental health counseling, and of all the disciplines that were available to them, they were really here in Asia and Shanghai and China and Southeast Asia and Cambodia, where both Wendel and I have gone. Family therapy was the most attractive of all those that they could pick from the Western models of psychotherapy, given that they really didn't have a sort of talk therapy before then. That has made it interesting as well. And Paul's ideas, I think, are just as relevant to them today as they were when Paul first wrote them down and expressed them to us. When we would teach together a little bit, Wendel and I did quite a few classes with Paul, where at the time that was a brand new technology. Remember that, Wendel? All the technology we had to do. Paul couldn't leave Palo Alto at the time because of his health, and Wendel was in Louisiana and I was in the University of Oregon in Oregon at the time, and I think that was one of the first of those type of classes, and Paul was the star of the show, and we really got to know him and the content of this paper from his contributions to that, which he was very generous about that. Yeah.
He was a lovely man, lovely, very generous is a good description of John.
That's a good segue into your article. So the article's title is Three Central Concepts in Teaching and Learning with Paul Watzlawick. The Importance of Avoiding Negation, Distinguishing Between Indicative and Injunctive Language, and Speaking the Client's Language. So it's a mouthful, but you've got a lot of stuff there. So, why'd you write it? What was your, hope that people would get from it? And give us a little teaser so people can go read the whole thing.
I am so glad we wrote that paper, John.
Me too.
I'm so glad we finally got around to publishing the thing. Actually, we talked about those ideas since we've known one another.
Yes, that's true.
Indicative, injunctive languages, what are the differences? Well, those are simple ideas once they've been expressed and you think about what they mean. But it's not an idea that is common to conversations I've had, let me phrase it, with other professionals. Yeah, I'm quite content with that paper. I've looked at it recently because you had mentioned that it would be part of our discussion. And I'm very happy to do anything with John. John is just sharp as could be, and really is taking family therapy to the world. And so, it's quite an honor from my point of view to have something in publication with him. And
Thanks,
the ideas
Wendel.
aren't bad. Yeah.
So John, could tell us a little bit about the article, impetus and maybe some takeaways.
Well, as Wendel said, ever since we were first talking, I met Wendel when I was still in my 20s, but our classes would continue long after class time was over. I remember that, Wendel, we used to stay up half the night talking. And these were three ideas that Wendel initially introduced me to from Paul. And the book he put in my hand that really summed it up was Pragmatics of Human Communication.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those ideas are in here, but these three we thought could be articulated further, both in our observation of, fundamentally from our observation of Paul in the classroom, and then afterwards when we would talk with him. And he was, like Wendel said, he was productive. I met him until he was very older. And I met him, I think, you remember, Wendel, the first time I met him, he was fairly senior. And I remember you took me to him, Wendel, actually in Palo Alto at the MRI, and he put a book in an article in my hand that he had just written. And I'm thinking, he's 80 years old, and he'd just written it. And he goes, I just finished this, and I would really love to know what you think. Will you please read it? And I thought, man, that's the kind of scholar I want to be. And these three ideas that he talks about are very kind of kismet with that spirit that he had. And so, we offer some case examples from the MRI and from Paul in the article that Wendel had, and Wendel has the archive of all those people that worked there, so he could find some great examples of that. But speaking the client's language, see, he's got a couple in there where it really mattered in the cases where he was describing, because the main sort of gridlock point with the case that he described, yeah, exactly, was the fact that a language change was needed to the one that the client was familiar with, and one I think was an engineer, and Paul changed the language from we have to be emotional about this thing to we have to make a stepwise phase process change, something like that, technical. And the father in the case immediately goes, now you're talking my language. Remember that, Wendel? The father was on board then for the rest of the case. And I think another one was a case where a mother was using the idea of my child is the wrong one or something like that, and the therapist could see that was causing things to stick, and they changed the language to, because this mother was all about sacrifice, and he changed the language to, you have sacrificed so much already, mother, and now I'm afraid to say, although it's hard, that you must sacrifice some more. And that's when she changed. And so Paul had these great examples from the MRI where, speaking the client's language, it's easy to say, but it's really more of a, it seems like a basic thing, but it's really about, not really even so much about language, but about getting into the mindset of the client and understanding it well enough to talk about it. That's what I thought, Wendell, but what would you add to that, Wendell?
I'm so glad you brought those examples up. How do I want to say this? It makes me miss MRI, is what it does in part. These are not just abstractions. When one says speak the client's language, that involves you taking the time to know who you're speaking with, really know, and then translating into their frame of reference language. And they aren't just some idea you hang on a wall. They operationalize these ideas. Those were great examples, John, and I vividly remember the two that you just brought up. Yeah.
I think so much of this connects to the idea of you can be as empathic as anybody, but if it doesn't come out in a way that resonates with the client, they're not going to get what they need clinically. How do you think some of this, these ideas, this concept of more effective language connection can apply to people all over the world, or even educators as they're helping, brand new professionals get better?
It's central and underused and and not understood well. And I could go on, but I don't want to get into. We should be at a bar with a beer if we're going to talk politics.
Well, I contribute a little something. I don't know if Paul intended for this or not. I know he knows a little bit about Eastern philosophy, but in this part of the world, one of the central concepts you learn as a Westerner coming here is the idea of Mianzi, which is face, maintaining face. And that first concept Paul taught us about avoiding negation. He said in that article, we wrote up his words, he said, "I have long since given up the practice of criticizing people." He basically said, if I thought it would work, I'd do it, but it's no good. Mm-hmm. And actually, all you will do is evoke people's defenses, I think was his point. And he said, there's just no point to it. And I think what he was getting at is the thing that's really central to Asian culture, what I see every day, is that you make people lose face. Mm-hmm. And no matter how clever your intervention is, after that point, people will disqualify you for the fundamental nature of the way you presented it to them. And that is doubly true in Asia, of course. So those ideas, they fit that part of the world, especially, I thought, that idea of avoiding negation. Wendell had a story. I don't know if, Wendell, you care if I repeat this story about, you were talking, I think, to one of your sons, and you had this example where you wanted them to mail a letter.
Yes.
But you said, don't forget to mail the letter that I asked you to. And you realized what all he really, and he forgot, of course, because all he heard is don't. Mm-hmm. Right? And you said, I got it at that point, that it was important to not, when you're doing that kind of thing, because the child will remember the don't, not the, and you switched it to remember to mail the letter, right? And that was a small example from everyday life about persuasion, I think, maybe, and motivation of people, and how people hear you when you speak clinically. And yeah, so Wendell, I don't know if would you add something to that?
That's a beautiful story. It's relevant to this moment in time. People, how do I want to say? It's as though people respond when you ask them to do things. If you ask them not to do something, they won't. And then the madness is when one gets upset with the other person for doing what you told them to do. He actually is so funny. I love my son so much. They're the best teachers in the world, children. And so,
sure.
Yeah. That
well, I got one.
Oh, go ahead, John. I'm sorry. No.
I had one
Oh.
other, it's a maybe a parallel, about speaking the client's language. Actually, one of the first books Wendel put in my hands as a student was the book Pragmatics of Human Communication, as I said, that had some of these ideas, at least in some formation in them. And it was inspirational to me. And when I came to China, I went to work for the university, and they said, we want to translate some of these family therapy books into Chinese. And they said, which one should we start with? And of course, I said, Pragmatics of Human Communication. We happen to have a copy of it here. I guess I showed you, this is their translated copy, and it's spread like wildfire over China. I think because Paul knew the basic operations of how people think. You asked the question, how might it be relevant around the world for this international journal and so on? And I think that my experience of having traveled quite a bit is that, yes, that's fundamentally a universal of human nature. These three concepts Paul gave us.
Let me say, the two books now, today, right now, this moment, at our program, that both the masters and PhDs start with, at least classes that I teach, are Pragmatics of Human Communication and Change. The book Change.
Yes.
And these are, I looked at Change like yesterday. I think it was published in 74. I think it was 74. Right. So these are not new books, but the ideas, my God, that they literally changed my life by reflecting on these things. That wonderful story John just mentioned about one of my sons, who was simply doing as I had asked him to do. Don't. And that's one of the, I should write my son a thank you note for underscoring the unimportance or the tragic relevance, let us say, of initiating negation and then living with its consequences. And if you want to think of what's happening in the world, I hope to goodness somebody's read these books that's making, big decisions in big places and applying them, because that's a big one, that idea.
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to bring you guys on after having the article published is just a reminder that, yes, there are new ideas every now and then, but so often we can be more efficient by applying some of the more effective ones from the past to our current circumstance and our current situation and still continue to grow. And obviously evergreen ideas such as the three that you guys presented from Paul applied to now. So I certainly hope everybody gets a chance to go look at the article. And thank you both so much for joining us and telling us a little bit about these ideas and how they connect with you.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks, Daniel.